This is a relatively short video on determining the fair value of financial assets. So let's go on and take a look at a little bit of background. Now, generally accepted accounting principles basically permits an entity to utilize fair value to measure the value of its financial assets and or liabilities. And this is generally called the fair value option, or it's abbreviated many times as FVO. Now, there's some interesting things in terms of the background about the fair value option. The first thing is that the fair value option can be applied instrument by instrument. In other words, if we apply the fair value option to one type of security in, let's say, our asset portfolio, what would happen is we would only apply that option to that security unless we want to apply it to the other securities. The other securities can be valued at some other valuation, such as cost. The fair value option, when we elect it, okay, it's elected when we first recognize that transaction regarding that security. Also, once a fair value option is elected, the decision is irrevocable. Now, there are some cases where the fair value option is prohibited, and these are the two major cases. And what you can see is basically it's regarding consolidation issues, where the investment in a subsidiary is to be consolidated. We can't use a fair value option in that case. Also, investments in variable interest entities, VIEs, that are going to be consolidated, we can't use a fair value option in this particular case either. Now, also, people are going to wonder, well, how do we account for a fair value option? If you go ahead and look at the video called or titled Accounting for Financial Investments, that will give you an explanation of accounting for securities under this rule we call the fair value option. Now, let's go on and take a look at what we call fair value measurement. Fair value can make accountants, especially CPAs, a little nervous because fair value can theoretically be in the eyes of the beholder. So the CPA, or when a company creates fair value, there are possibilities that it can manipulate that fair value based upon its objectives. So the FASB created what they call a hierarchy of inputs in order to determine fair value. And they're called level 1 inputs through level 3 inputs. Level 1 inputs are the inputs that should be used. Those are the most desirable inputs. If we cannot use level 1 inputs for whatever reason, we have to resort to level 2 inputs. Level 2 inputs are not as desirable as level 1 inputs, but if we have to, we'd resort to using them. Then if we can't use level 2 inputs, we have to resort to using level 3 inputs, which are the least desirable of the 3 inputs. So this establishes an overall hierarchy. Let's go ahead and talk about level 1 inputs first, because level 1 inputs are probably what you're most familiar with. And these are inputs from unadjusted quoted prices in active markets for identical assets or liabilities that the entity can access at the measurement date. You're going to hear the word, especially in the news, if they're talking about an accounting issue, they're going to be talking about, if we're talking about level 1 inputs, it'd be called the mark to market. And as an example of a level 1 input, this would be a case where let's assume that you want to use a fair value option to value your General Motors stock. So in order to do that, you can look up the option online, or you can look up the stock online in an actively traded market, basically, which would be the New York Stock Exchange, and you can look up General Motors stock. So you have an identical asset that's being held in a price that's established for an identical asset in an active market. So that's what we call level 1 input. Now, level 1 inputs Sometimes it is possible that a level 1 input cannot actually be used to establish the fair value. Uh, the FASB says fair value is derived from an orderly transaction. In other words, there is basically people have time to consider what the transactions are and so forth, that they're executed in orderly fashion. It says the rule explicitly states that an orderly transaction is not a forced or liquidation or distressed sale. So let's assume right now that matter of fact, let's use the example of mortgage-backed securities. Those are the securities that basically collapsed in as part of the 2007-2008 financial crisis. Mortgage-backed securities were traded on the open markets, and when a number of mortgage-backed securities started to become, there was a realization that some of these securities were worthless. That affected the entire MBS market. And what happened was that the market value literally collapsed on all MBS securities. And what happened was that everybody's following the accounting rules, mark to market, and literally banks and other financial institutions or other people who own these mortgage-backed securities had to take their securities at whatever level they were and mark them to basically near zero. Uh, so what happened was that the FASB came up with, and under the pressure from Congress, that said that the market had to be established based upon an orderly transaction, not something a distress sale or a panic type of sale. So there can be situations where you look at an observable input in an active market and it may not represent a level 1 input. Okay, we also then, if we don't use a level 1 input, we have to use a level 2 input, which is an observable input models and are used to determine the fair value of the item being measured. And many times, again, you'll hear this referred to marking the model. And in this case, models use what we call observable inputs, which includes quoted prices for similar assets and other relevant market data such as interest yield. So what that's really saying is we can't find a particular security or a particular valuation of our security. In other words, it's not identical. Or it's not necessarily traded in a very active market or so forth. What we'll try to do is find something that is close to our security and model its valuation based upon that other observable security, that in effect from the third party observable model. And that's how we'll establish its fair value. Level 3 then is the least desirable of all the securities, and these are unobservable inputs to models that are used in the absence of observable inputs. In other words, the inputs are based upon the entity's own assumptions about what's going on with that particular security. So sometimes it's a little bit harder to determine the objectivity with these level 3 type of models. Okay, now with that information, let's go on and start looking at some of the multiple choice questions and determining fair value financial instruments. So let's start off with multiple choice question number 1. And the fair value of an asset should be based upon. And again, I haven't explicitly given you the answer as it's written here, but I think based upon the fact that we've just kind of talked about what fair value is, you should be able to arrive at you can certainly tell what it isn't based upon these answers, then arrive at the correct answer. So again, stop your video. When you're ready, restart your video. Okay, the answer to number 1 is the fair value of an asset should be based upon B, the price it would be received to sell the asset under normal market conditions. It would not be the replacement cost of an item. It wouldn't be the carrying value of the asset, or it wouldn't be original cost plus inflation, an inflation index adjustment. Okay, let's go on to question number 2. Number 2, which of the following best describes a principal market for establishing the fair value of an asset? Again, we're given 4 different choices. Go ahead and stop your video. When you're ready, restart your video for the answer slide. Okay, number 2, which of the following best describes a principal market for establishing fair value of an asset? And in this case, the answer is A, the market that has the greatest volume and level of activity for the asset. And again, if we take a look at from our previous slide, we said inputs from unadjusted quoted prices in active markets for identical assets or liabilities that the entity can access at measurement date. And I've had some students argue, well, any broker or dealer that sells the asset, that is not necessarily the market. Okay, let's go on now to question number 3. Question number 3, which of the following would meet qualifying market participants in determining fair value? So again, take a look at the question, stop your video. When you're ready for the answer, restart your video. And the answer to number 3 is, which of the following would be qualifying market participants in determining fair value? And the answer in this case, C, an independent entity that is knowledgeable about the asset. Okay, let's go on to question number 4. Number 4, in measuring fair value, which level of input has the highest priority as to valuation? So again, stop your video, and then when you're ready to look at the answer, go ahead and restart the video. And number 4, in measuring fair value, which level input has the highest priority as to valuation? The answer would be A, mark to market. That's a level 1 input. Level B would be modeling with observable inputs, which would be level 2, and then modeling with unobservable inputs would be level 3. Okay, let's go on to question number 5. Which of the following are observable inputs used for fair market value measurements, or which can be used for fair market value measurement? So again, stop your video, and when you're ready for the answer, restart the video and view the answer slide. Okay, and the answer with number 5, which of the following are observable inputs used for the fair valuation measurement? And the answer in this case would be B, 1 and 2. 3, it talks about a company's forecast of student loan defaults. That really is an observable input. The bank prime rate is a real observable input, and the federal student loan default rate, which is published, is another observable input. A company's forecast of student loan defaults really doesn't fit under that definition. So with that, that's the end of the multiple choice questions for determining the fair value of financial instruments. So have a good evening. Thank you. Bye.